Well, welcome again as we continue our sort of survey through church history. If you have a Bible, open up to John, the Gospel of John, chapter 17. As you're turning, I want to tell you a phrase that many people think is in the Bible, but it's not. The words being in the world but not of the world, those words don't actually appear in the Bible. But that concept certainly does. And in John chapter 17, beginning in verse 14, Jesus is praying, as we know, his high priestly prayer. He's praying for the disciples and for the church. And he says in verse 14, "I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world." So here Jesus is saying that he's not of the world, and that his disciples, including we today who are his disciples, are not of the world. He goes on, "I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one." So we're not of this world, but we are in this world. And Jesus specifically says to the Father, I don't pray that you take them out. And then lastly, in verse 16, "They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world." Here's where one of a couple of passages, there's another we could look at, we won't, I think this is clear, that teaches this concept that disciples are not of this world, although we not only are in this world, but that Jesus specifically does not want the Father to take us out of the world. Now, seriously minded Christians and those desiring to be free from worldliness have often erred in retreating from the world. But it's nothing new. We see this even as we consider in chapter 14 Christianity of the Cloisters. In the 4th century, that's the 300s, devout Christians who were disenchanted with the formalism that was in the church and the worldliness that was creeping into the church, retreated from the world, or at least tried to, into what became known as the monastic life. The monastic life, you may recognize that word from monasteries. People who live in monasteries live the monastic lifestyle. The monastic life is a life of separation from the world and is usually a self-imposed denial of physical pleasures in favor of spiritual pursuits. Now, at first blush, that's not a bad thing. But again, it's not the Lord's will that we retreat out of the world, just that we not be of the world. We're still in it. We still live here. The monastic movement seemed to gain its traction in the eastern wing of the church. Now, when I say the eastern wing, I don't know what you think of as you look at as a map. We might think of the Greek and the Russian and whatever. But also in that eastern wing is the Middle East and North Africa. And this is a place where these things began. And as we've said before, the Eastern church tended to be a little bit more mystical, whereas the Western church tended to be a little bit more pragmatic and practical. By the end of the 6th century, that's the 500s, and this again, things move slowly, it's 200 years later, monasticism had become a very important part of the Western church, Western Christianity as well. Monasticism has surged at times in church history. We see it, as we're talking here, in the 4th century, it sort of began to gain momentum, and by the 6th century, it was also seen in the western part of the church. But monasticism had some real times of resurgence in the 10th and the 11th and the 13th and even in the 16th centuries as well. The monastic movement is very much still alive today. in the Roman Catholic Church and to some degree in the Eastern Orthodox churches. And then, of course, it attracts certain fringe groups that are neither. I mean, let's face it, Jim Jones and that kind of thing is an exaggerated idea, of course, built on totally false theology, of we need to retreat from the world and go live in a jungle someplace. And of course, we know how that worked out for those poor folks in Jonestown. Why monasticism? Well, there's a couple of reasons for monasticism. A couple of reasons that it flourished. The first is theological, though not always correct. Theological, but not always correct. If you remember, we talked before about the Gnostics, and the Gnostics was a heretical sort of movement, and it was based on largely on the idea of dualism, that there's good and there's evil, and ne'er the twain shall meet, and here's where it really becomes serious, is that everything that is physical is worldly and therefore bad, and everything that is spiritual, not physical, but metaphysical, spiritual, is good. And this poses some certain problems. People who believe that everything in the physical realm is bad are quite likely to retreat from the world. That was one of the reactions to this sort of dualistic Gnosticism, was to say, well, we have to live an ascetic lifestyle and leave everything out of the world. Now, the Bible does speak of the need of separation from the world. But let's not forget what Jesus said. I don't ask you, Father, to take them out of it, but rather to keep them pure and to protect them from the evil one while they are in it, and which is where we get the idea that, yes, we are in the world, but we're not of the world. Okay, that's where the idea comes from. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is an example of how we are to be still living in the world and yet not of the world. Paul advocated celibacy as his preferred lifestyle. This led some to believe that Christians should not, and this is taking it to the extreme, some should not engage in sexual activity at all whatsoever. Well, if that were to happen, guess what? We're the last generation. Obviously, that is not God's plan for everyone. This is what happens, folks. Listen, this is what happens when people take certain teachings, lift them out of the Scripture, overemphasize them to the neglect of other passages that bring balance into our theological worldviews. The second reason, so the first reason why monasticism flourished was theological, even though a lot of it was erroneous, a lot of it was mistaken. The other reason that monasticism flourished was that Christians were being persecuted. And it's not a bad idea to say, well, where can we go to get away from persecution? Jesus said, if they don't receive the gospel in this place, do what? Kick the dirt from your feet, move to the next town. It's not unbiblical to try to avoid persecution. And so because of that, people would try to escape physical death while sort of dying to the flesh, so to speak. And this helped fuel the idea of monasticism. How did it develop? How did monasticism develop? Well, some withdrew without actually leaving. This, I would think, would be more in keeping with what the Scriptures are saying. We want to be separate from the world, and yet we do need to continue to live here. Others, though, felt as no, I need to physically withdraw myself into the wilderness to live as a hermit, to live as later on, the monks in the monasteries and these sorts of things. The radical lifestyles of these hermits attracted other people, but as is typical, sort of goofy people can attract other people, but what kind of people do goofy people tend to attract? Other goofy people. Yeah, and so that's kind of what happened. Get enough people wanting to withdraw from society, from culture, from where things are happening. You get enough people agreeing to do that and coming together, and what do you have? A monastery. That's what happens. It was individuals who said, we need to get away from it all because we want to serve the Lord. And you get enough people saying, yeah, we do too, and we want to do it the way you do. And this group says, we want to do it slightly different. And what you have is monasteries developing. So much of monasticism neglects much of what the Bible tells Christians to be doing, as we're going to see in a moment. It totally removes us from being evangelistic. It totally removes us from being influential in the culture, letting our worldview seep in and permeate. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some of the early leaders of monasticism. Anthony, who lived from 251 to 356, he was the founder, so to speak, of Christian monasticism. Again, individuals were doing this, but this is when it started to come together into monasteries. He was an Egyptian Eastern Christian, which means he was a Coptic Christian, who sought to follow the Scriptures literally, especially in his personal life. When he was about 18 years old, he tried to live of self-denial while staying in the world, right there in his hometown. And he then retreated to live in the ruins of an old abandoned castle. It just seemed, as we can understand, it would be easier to not be tempted by the things of the world to go live in nowhere, so to speak. He lived in strict solitude, except, as history records, a trip into town twice a year to get food, which consisted of bread, salt, and a few dates. Wow, that's living. Apart from his eccentricity, his theology was surprisingly orthodox. One place this can be seen is he was on the right side of the argument against Arianism, against Arius, who denied the deity of Christ. And this Anthony greatly influenced others who sought to follow his example. And just as an interesting footnote, he lived to be 106 years old. So maybe dates are good for you. I'm not sure. Other monks were not quite so orthodox as was Anthony. A small percentage of them had very bizarre ideas about how to be spiritual. Here's a couple of my favorite, and I mean no disrespect, but you know what I mean. These are some of my favorite kooks. St. Simon Stylites lived for several years buried up to his neck. It's hard to get into trouble that way, at least in actions. By the way, can you see a spiritual and a theological problem with the idea, if I just limit my body, I won't be sinning? I don't know how many of you have read Johnny Erickson's autobiography, but I found, to me, the most fascinating thing in that whole story was when she was first paralyzed and laying in that bed. They would flip her every now and then just to keep blood moving and what have you. She realized that she did not need her body in order to sin, because she says, I entertained sinful thoughts. And isn't that where sin begins? This is why we say, you cannot reform the life without there being a transformation and a reformation of the mind and of the heart and of the will and of the affections. Just try to cinch yourself in by, bearing yourself up to your neck, for instance. That isn't going to change your thoughts. In fact, you might really have some nasty thoughts as you look around at people who are walking about and you're not. So he saw that there was some drawbacks from that and that it didn't really work. So he moved and he lived on top of a 60-foot pole for 30 years. 35 years. You look at that, you say, man, what a godly guy. He's living on a pole. I mean, it's better than living buried up to your neck, but it's still kind of missing the point. Another hermit walked around naked in the vicinity of Mount Sinai out in the desert for 50 years. He just didn't want to have the sin of pride about fashion, I guess. I'm not exactly sure. Alone, we're hoping. But nonetheless, these are some of the kooky ideas. And one wonders, and you don't have to wonder very long if you have any spiritual compass pointing north, so to speak, but one wonders how these activities could possibly glorify Christ, how they could possibly build up the body of Christ, or how they could possibly influence, much less evangelize, people in the world. The first organized monastery was established in 320 by Pachomius. He was born of wealthy parents. He was converted to Christianity at about the age of 20. He served in the military for a number of years, and upon being discharged from the military, he began to organize hermits and monks into communities, established set communities, and this is sort of the beginning of organized monasticism. He, maybe because of his military background, he really regimented their lifestyle. It was like, you know, you're going to military academy. And that's the way they lived. He established a similar order for females as well. He put his sister in charge of that, to lead that. By the time he died, there were 9 cloisters for men and 2 for women. And it was not a bad movement. However, it was very much, once again, based on externals rather than spiritual. And all of the reformation of physical cannot hope to change the heart. It needs to be the other way around. So this is part of their issues. Another interesting fellow, Basil of Caesarea, he's lived from 1330 to 1379. He was also known as Basil the Great. He was another positive spot in the monastic movement. He encouraged monks not to sit around and do nothing and just be quiet. Because, by the way, some of the vows they took, not only vows of chastity and all these things, but they took vows of silence, and sometimes they just sat around and prayed. And it's like, well, that's great, but is that really a picture of the Christian life as given in the New Testament? I think we would all have to say, no, not at all, not at all. So Basil, he encouraged monks to work. They actually became productive. They actually, as did some monastic places, some monasteries, they had industry and they did things and they were beneficial to the people around them. But to work, to pray, to read the Bible, and to perform good deeds. So they were told to go do good. And that's not a bad thing at all. This was in contrast to those who stressed not doing anything. We just need to go sit and be quiet. We need to live a cloistered life. We need to eat bread and figs, and we need to be quiet. And we need to pray. We need to produce nothing. We need to do nothing. That doesn't glorify the Lord. You know, we got to ask ourselves, is our Christianity defined by what we don't do? You know, even we today, we need to, well, we don't smoke, and we don't smoke, and we don't smoke. And we don't drink, and we don't drink, and we don't drink. And we don't dance, and we don't dance, and we don't dance. And as we said before, the answer to the question, can Christians dance, is some can and some really can't. And those who really can't probably really shouldn't. But we don't want to be, idleness. Idleness doesn't glorify the Lord. I always think of what parents say to their children when they're leaving their children with a babysitter. They say, be good. They don't mean that. They don't care if the kids do any good at all. What they mean is, don't light the garage on fire. Don't do something really bad. See, in this monastic life says, well, I'm not doing anything really bad, therefore it must be good. No, you cannot be doing bad while at the same time not doing any good. And the Christian life is one that should be doing good, not just not doing bad. Basil discouraged extreme or exaggerated asceticism. He said, don't just sit around and do nothing. So we can thank him for that balancing influence. Basil was a theologian and among the very first to help formulate the idea of the Trinity being one in essence. So he was a theologian, and we're glad for him in that. He was very strong on the subject of the deity of Christ.